The manhwa begins with the surrender of the human king to the vampires, who apologizes for his ancestors and offers them anything in exchange for sparing his life. We are told that the battle ended with the victory of the vampires, and their leader decapitates the king while telling the rest that this is the place for all humans. Then we see the battlefield filled with human corpses, where two vampires seek to finish off the last group. Among them, a girl tells them that they don't have much time left because God spoke to her in a dream, saying that he will send a hero to save the humans. But the vampires mock her and say that there is no tomorrow for them. Then a vampire lunges at the humans, dodging and slicing the first one who tries to confront him in two. The next one leaps at him, but with a single move, he cuts him in half, and he impales another one who remained paralyzed by fear. There, an elderly warrior attacks him from behind, but the vampire stops his sword with his hand and cuts it in half, and then he finishes him off. The vampire then tells the children that he will now kill them without pain. But as he is about to strike, he hears a scream that catches his attention. The vampires turn around and see that it's a knight, the protagonist, whom they ask who he is, and they realize that he doesn't smell like a living human, so he must be a corpse. The knight leaps forward, and the vampire acknowledges his bravery for attacking the vampires when he suddenly appears in front of him. And while the vampire reflects on the fact that the protagonist covered 10 meters in one jump, we see that the protagonist has finished off the vampire, so his companion jumps to kill him and manages to impale his heart with his sword. However, the protagonist doesn't die, and as the vampire fails to understand what is happening, the protagonist grabs him by the head and pierces his heart with a single blow. The girl calls him a hero, and the protagonist tells them that they will find a sanctuary if they walk in a straight line. She asks him if he is the hero that God sent to save them, but then the protagonist takes off his helmet and asks them if he still looks like a hero in their eyes, and his nose falls off, so the children scream that he is a monster and run away. Then we are told about the rumor of a vampire fighter, the only knight who could not die. Some time before, we see a group of scientists entering an abandoned coliseum, where they find the corpse of the protagonist who died standing, having been the greatest warrior of that era, with 228 victories and 0 defeats, and the best artificial body capable of defeating vampires. The scientist asks about the condition of the corpse, and they tell him that the decomposition is still within tolerable limits. Then the scientist removes her mask, and we see that she is a girl who says that in desperate times, the hero will live forever. Then we see the protagonist on top of a pile of corpses, and someone congratulates him for being the survivor once again. Suddenly, he wakes up, and the scientists say it is a success. The protagonist says he was certain that he died, but the girl tells him that he was born again to save humanity. They bring him a mirror where the protagonist sees himself hanging from chains and without limbs, so he calls himself a monster. But the girl tells him that he is the last hope of humanity, and in his brain, there is a device called the life-sustaining apparatus. Unless destroyed, it prevents the protagonist from dying even if his body explodes. In addition, he can use a modified body and limbs with special muscles that will allow him to fight better than the vampires. Then the protagonist asks if that is the reason they brought him back to life, and they tell him that it is, and they ask him to fight alongside them to save humanity. The protagonist says he has a condition and asks someone to come closer to listen. But when the general does, the protagonist traps him with his thighs and says that his condition is for them to stop talking and get him out of there, while stating that he became the greatest warrior because he doesn't hesitate to kill people, and that humans are as dirty as vampires, and the fact that they have him like this is proof of that. So, he only cares about his own life, and if they don't want him to kill the general, they must give him arms and legs so he can leave. Then the girl takes out a watch and says that the protagonist only has 4 seconds left. He faints after asking what she is talking about. Some time later, the protagonist wakes up, and they explain that the fuel that keeps him alive is the life of a human being. And we see that he is connected to the girl, who tells him that she needs him to inject life into her so she can move, and it only lasts for 2 hours, as she, named Arian, is the only human with a motorized body that the transplant worked on and the only one who can carry him. So the general asks him if he will fight for humans to keep her alive and for him to be able to live. Suddenly, vampires appear in the facility. They say they are looking for treasures and beautiful women, so the protagonist tells them to hurry up and connect their limbs. The general agrees and asks the scientists to buy them some time. But they are not warriors and say they don't want to die, so Arian grabs a crossbow and runs towards the vampires to buy them time. They ask her if she's not afraid to face them alone, as they are superior to her. But Arian shoots and tells them they talk too much. The vampire manages to stop the arrow and furiously lunges at the girl. She continues shooting, but she can't stop the vampire. He kicks her down and then lifts her by the neck, telling her she has a beautiful face. This makes the other vampire say that he wants her, and they start fighting over her. When the protagonist appears and destroys one of their heads, he scolds Arian for letting her guard down and fighting carelessly. When the vampire returns and says she is his, the protagonist is surprised that she hasn't died, and Arian tells him that vampires regenerate if their heart isn't destroyed. The vampire attacks again, so the protagonist pushes Arian away and takes the blow directly. But nothing happens to him, and with a single strike, he sends the confused monster flying. There, the other vampire takes the opportunity to go after Arian, but the protagonist stops him too, surprising the girl and the general. They realize that despite having the same strength as the vampires, the protagonist is not aiming for their hearts because he is enjoying the fight. The warrior finally immobilizes the vampire, who asks him who he is and if humans now create monsters, to which the protagonist says it's unfortunate for those to be his last words. But when he is about to kill him, the vampire says he has an offer that he is sure they will like. The protagonist decides to listen, and the vampire warns him that if he kills them, his lord, Benzel, will find out and come back to avenge them in 1 hour. The protagonist asks why someone named Benzel would avenge them, and the vampire says it's because he is the only one in the world who loves them. So, if he hands over Arian, he will let the rest go in silence. The protagonist says no, but he can give them the general, and the vampire says he's of no use to him. So the protagonist kills him and says that the negotiations end there. The protagonist also kills the other vampire and asks who Benzel is. Arian tells him that he is a high-ranking vampire and explains about the types of vampires that exist. The first are pure blood vampires, who have been vampires since birth. Then there are the high vampires, born with the blood of the pure blood vampires. And then the low vampires, born from the mix between a junior vampire and a pure blood vampire, the rank to which the two they killed belong. Arian also tells him that there are few high-ranking vampires and they are vulnerable to sunlight. They are also powerful enough to defy human logic. The general tells them they should prepare to face Benzel, but Arian asks the protagonist first if he will really help them fight against the vampires. The protagonist reflects for a moment and says that he only cares about his own life, but there's not much he can do in that situation, so he agrees to cooperate for the time being. Arian thanks him, and the protagonist asks to connect with her to recharge energy, but before that, she tells him she has a gift. And then we see the protagonist in armor, and the general asks for his opinion because he made it based on several drafts. But the protagonist says it's in poor taste. There, Arian tells him that it's made of mithril and was designed to be very resistant, and minimize damage since he is slower than the vampires. And she explains that there is an approximate estimation of the remaining time he has to move on his wrists. Then they start hearing strange noises coming from the ceiling, and the protagonist says they are already coming down, and there are many of them. This surprises the general because only 40 minutes have passed. The protagonist asks Arian to cut the connection and asks her about the entrance and escape route, but she tells him there is only one entrance and exit, and the protagonist complains that she should have told him earlier. At that moment, the noise seems to have arrived, so the protagonist puts on his helmet and tells them to stay behind him, and 3 heads peek through the door. These heads say that it was the protagonist who killed their family, and he confirms that he dealt with them. So the heads congratulate him and say it was good that he defended himself since they tried to kill him, and they apologize to him. The protagonist is speechless and tells the general that he got scared for nothing if he is Benzel. So the bald one steps forward and apologizes for murdering his family. But since he killed his companions, they should be even. And since she is willing to talk, they should leave it at that and go their separate ways. He says that would be fine. However, they swore to Julius that they would kill all humans. The group says they were already expecting that. So the protagonist asks him if he's okay with that because it seems like he's too strong for them to handle alone. This makes Benzel laugh, who says that humans are amusing and that low-ranking vampires are only there to protect the high-ranking ones when the sun comes out. Otherwise, no one could kill them, as we see that Benzel is composed of hundreds of faces, earning him the nickname the Face Collector. Arian realizes that the faces are connected by blood, so there must be a body among them that, if they manage to destroy it, the rest will collapse immediately. Suddenly, Benzel lunges at the girl, but we see that the protagonist saves her while saying that the vampire is faster and stronger than he thought, and he tells her to go to a safe place. Benzel is about to devour a scientist when the protagonist punches him and saves him. And as he strikes the faces, he says that if he doesn't know where the body is, he'll just have to destroy everything. Benzel praises him for his power and wonders if there was anyone with such strength among humans. But he says no and asks him back why he wants to know, when Benzel traps his fist with one of the mouths. And he tells him that his bite is more potent than his strength, so once he catches him, he won't be able to escape. The protagonist tries to free himself with a punch, but Benzel also traps his arm, as well as his legs, leaving him immobilized. And then he takes him inside, telling him that there lies the true hell. We see a crying child in a land full of dead people, whose screams haven't been heard by anyone in days, until suddenly the cries are no longer heard. But the child didn't survive with someone's support but with their own strength. And we see the protagonist inside Benzel, who says that his biting strength is incredibly strong, and he wonders if his limbs are already broken and where the escape route could be. And he concludes that it's below, but his chances are minimal when suddenly he hears a voice saying, "Dirty vampires," and he sees a bunch of faces clamoring battle cries against the vampires. Then Benzel says that the name of the first one is Albert Lauren, a hero who fought against vampires to save hundreds of people. But now he's just part of his collection. The protagonist then realizes that they have hair and a pedestal unlike other faces, so he asks if he's special. And Benzel says it's because of their beautiful faces, and their noble sacrifices will endure there until the end of humanity without aging. However, the protagonist tells him that his face will hardly be there. He tells him, on the contrary, that his willpower and strength are the best among all the heroes he has seen in years. But the protagonist tells him it's because of his appearance, and Benzel asks if he's really that ugly. So the protagonist asks him to take off his helmet, and the vampire says he's a monster. So the protagonist asks him to let him go since he doesn't need him. But Benzel says he won't be able to do it in that condition, to which the protagonist responds that he's not the only one with teeth, and he starts biting the faces. Benzel tells him that it won't be enough because no one has managed to escape from there. But the protagonist tells him that he's not no one, but Gunter, who no matter what happens will ensure his survival, while biting and destroying the faces. Outside, humans wonder if it's the end, and the general says that the protagonist was not the savior of the species, so humanity is lost. When Aryan warns that some faces started to fall, and the protagonist appears, making his way through blows. So the general shouts that he always believed in him. There, they see that he lost his legs, and he tells them to change the plan because he has no chance of winning. And he carries Aryan on his back, while saying that the new strategy is to flee until the sun rises. Benzel attacks again, and the protagonist narrowly avoids it. Aryan tells him that she has some spare limbs for him to use, but he says there's no time and he needs to increase the distance between him and the vampire as much as possible. So he starts running, and Benzel catches sight of Aryan's face, prompting him to chase after them to get her. Both of them manage to hide, and the girl tells him that there are 5 minutes left until sunrise, so they plan to run towards the exit. When a scream catches their attention, they see that the general and the scientists are about to be devoured. The protagonist says they will take advantage of their sacrifice to escape silently, and he asks Aryan if she understands that it's for the future of humanity. But after staring at each other, she goes out screaming at Benzel that she's there. So the monster attacks her, and the protagonist rescues her again, telling him that if they can save them, they must give it their all. Thus, the protagonist has no other choice and says they will make their way through. Then he makes a leap towards the exit, narrowly evading Benzel, and they manage to reach the stairs, while the monster tells Aryan that her courage moved him and asks her to please join him. The pair almost reaches the top when Benzel grabs the protagonist's arm, which he destroys with a blow, and they manage to get outside. But then Benzel catches up to Aryan and takes her back inside amid the desperate cries of the protagonist. We see one of Benzel's faces on the ground, witnessing the arrival of the sun and starting to burn, just like others at the entrance of a cave. Inside, we see the protagonist injured, and the vampires ask if he's okay. He tells them that his family's revenge failed because of a monstrous night, so the vampires offer to seek revenge on his behalf. But he tells them that the protagonist is not someone they can deal with, and he can't afford to lose more members of his family. So he must be the one to deal with the protagonist, and he asks them to bring him new faces. Later, we see that the vampires have gathered a group of people, and they tell Benzel that they have brought him 34 individuals. Among them are 7 with beautiful faces. Benzel tells them that they are great faces and that they did a good job. But he says that he still likes Aryan's face more. He turns to the girl and tells her not to be afraid because once inside him, she will witness the end of humanity in his company. In a scene change, we see the protagonist shouting at the general to connect his limbs faster. But the general asks him not to look at him since he can't perform when being watched. The protagonist still rushes him and tells him they will move as soon as he has his legs attached, since he has less than half the time remaining. He also asks if he will be able to move without Aryan, in case they manage to develop a new motorized body. But the general asks him if he wouldn't save Aryan if that were the case, and he tells him it's impossible because the device in his head is not something that regenerates his corpse, and that's why when a certain degree of decomposition is reached, it cannot be brought back to life. That will happen in 3 days, after which the protagonist's body will completely stop, rot, and can no longer return to life. The general explains that it's because they did it in a dangerous place, and they found out about his death late, so they ran without eating or drinking to arrive before his body decomposed. And developing more motorized humans won't be possible in the coming years, so without Aryan, he will most likely die. The protagonist then asks what the device in his brain is, but the general cannot tell him yet, and he will consider telling him when they build more trust in their relationship. The general finishes attaching his legs and says everything is connected, but the protagonist says his right arm is still missing, to which the general responds that he prepared something special for that, and although it's still incomplete, they were developing a modified weapon for long-range use, and he asks what the protagonist thinks about it, which excites the protagonist. In a scene change, one of the citizens is offered to Benzel. He uses their blood to wrap his head and join it to his being, terrifying the other captives. And he tells Aryan that now it's her turn. He says that stiff, fearless eyes in the final moment are his favorites, and he wants to see the moment they realize the truth and become stained with fear. But Aryan tells him that the most terrifying truth for her at that moment is that no one has saved Benzel's heart. So he tells her that she's very funny and that he will make her repeat that over and over again when he has her face. But then one of the villagers shouts and rushes at the vampire with a knife, while telling him that he has been waiting for the moment to catch him off guard. But then we see that he was immobilized by the faces, while the vampires apologize for not stopping him. The villager shouts that even if he fails, another will appear to pierce his heart. And Benzel says that it's always fun to meet a hero like him, as he believes it's worth sacrificing for humanity. And that is a repugnant and vain belief because he is aware of all that. There, he tells him that his horrible hand is like that because he saved some people from a burning house, which ended up melting his flesh, but he still ran to save at least one more. And although he received praise and respect from people for a while, what he mostly got was contempt and disappointment. The villager asks why people did that, and then Benzel shows him his face and tells him it was because of how it ended. The villager becomes terrified, and Benzel says that those who called him a hero started to hate him after seeing his melted face, and he lost his place in the world because no one wanted a monster like him, despite sacrificing himself for humans. Benzel covers his body again and tells the villager that his sacrifice is in vain because humans only harm people. However, the villager tells him that his past doesn't justify the killing and that he's just a murderer, and he's about to get his face when the protagonist says he talks too much and a projectile is fired. The protagonist asks about the weapon's accuracy rate since it flies at his command, and the general tells him that's why he warned him that it was still incomplete. Aryan feels relieved to see the protagonist, and he feels the same seeing her alive, and he tells her that he was going to kill her if she died. Benzel calls him an idiot for crawling there with his own feet and says he must want to die. But the protagonist tells him it's the opposite, and it's time for the second round because they're running out of time, and one of them has to be dead by the time it's over. The general explains that the weapon is called a bone launcher, and it is a mass of muscles that surround the bone spine. These muscles slowly contract to the limit and accumulate strength, and then release it to shoot bone spikes with destructive power and speed stronger than any crossbow. However, after firing the 6 bone spikes, they become useless. But the protagonist says that he will still be able to keep his distance from Benzel. There we see him and the general on their way to the cave, and the general tells him that he must kill him within the little time he has left. Otherwise, they won't be able to escape from the low-class vampires. Those vampires will disappear if he manages to kill Benzel, although he doesn't know if it will be possible to do it so quickly. And the protagonist tells the general that he may die, but he is sure that he will survive. Back in the present, the protagonist says that he only has 15 minutes left, but he is confident that it will be impressive. Benzel says that it's interesting what he has prepared, but by stacking several layers of faces, he will create a barrier that cannot be penetrated. Then the protagonist shoots again and pierces through all the faces without any problem. He says that he failed again, but now he knows exactly where to shoot, so the next one will pierce Benzel's heart. Benzel tells the vampires to stay away, but they tell him that they are faster than him and will immobilize him. So Benzel agrees, and the vampires rush at the protagonist, being cautious of the bone weapon. But he tells them not to worry because it's not for them, and he kills the first one using his fist. Another one appears from behind and grabs the protagonist, saying that they won't be defeated by him. The protagonist grabs his face and says that he is not yet strong enough, but he manages to make it explode and throw him away. Benzel attacks him, and the protagonist dodges while other vampires try to trap him, but he kills them with a single blow until one dying vampire manages to grab his foot. And he tells him that Benzel is the only one who treated them like people, so they vowed to give their lives for him since then. But then Benzel tells the vampire that he did well, and we see that the monster managed to put the protagonist's head in its mouth. And he tells him that this time he will chew his face first. But the protagonist shoots another spike to free himself and kills the vampire on the ground with a kick. He dodges an attack while thinking that he must be careful because he only has 3 shots left. But all the faces look the same, and he doesn't know how to locate Benzel. Then Arian starts shouting the monster's name, and the vampires try to silence her without damaging her face too much. The protagonist wonders what she's doing when another low-class vampire attacks him and kills him with one blow. Then Arian starts shouting again, and the protagonist thinks she has gone crazy when she tells Benzel that he is a horrible monster, and one of the faces grimaces. Benzel tells her that it makes no sense for her to crawl like that, but the girl tells the protagonist to take a closer look, because there are some faces that react, and those are the ones that are closest to Benzel. The lesser vampire holds Arian to silence her, but then the protagonist shoots to see Benzel's reaction, and he finds the face that moves first, so he shoots and finds the vampire. He tells him that even so, if he doesn't succeed on the first try, it's over, and when he hides among his faces, it won't work again. There he realizes that some of his nerves were severed and he must reconnect them. But the protagonist tells him that he won't be able to, as he still has 2 shots left, and he will give it his all now. So he shoots again and destroys Benzel's arm. The protagonist runs while saying that it's the last step, and the vampires stand in his way to block him with their bodies. When he shoots his last spike, piercing through them and disintegrating Benzel's face, but he didn't manage to hit him in the heart, and Arian says it's a failure, warning the protagonist that he will have to destroy the device in his head. However, he emerges from among the vampires and says that he hasn't failed yet because he still has 1 shot left. Arian asks him what he's talking about, and as he is propelled towards Benzel, he says that the last shot is his own body, just as the vampire finishes regenerating his head. Long ago, we see a man who says he joined the city guard because he believed that saving humans was the most valuable thing in the world. Just like his father, he wanted to be a hero who fights to save humans. But then we see his deformed face, and that man is Benzel. Children on the street throw stones at him for being a monster and looking disgusting. This plunged him into despair, and he asked his father if his sacrifice for humans was truly worth it. If sacrificing himself for those who treat him like a monster was worth it, and he no longer knew what to believe in or what to do. Then we see a vampire putting his hand on his head, and this vampire is Julius, who says he has been observing him for a long time and wants to create a new world. But the process will be very harsh and painful, so he needs the help of men like him. Benzel then asks him what kind of world it will be, and Julius tells him without us knowing what it is about, but what he tells Benzel moves him. He asks Benzel if he will be with him, and Benzel agrees, just as we see the protagonist's fist pierce his body, while saying that it is his victory. In his last moments, Benzel wonders if the world Julius wants includes a monster like the protagonist. Benzel then disintegrates, and along with him, all the low-rank vampires, and the protagonist faints. Some time later, we see a caravan, and the protagonist wakes up aboard it. He stands up and asks what is happening when Arian tells him to be careful because they are connected, and that he won't be able to move aggressively for a while. She thanks him for his hard work, as they were able to save many lives thanks to him. And the general tells him it's incredible because he didn't expect him to get rid of a high-ranking vampire in such a short time. The protagonist says it was close and asks if all the low-rank vampires also disappeared, which the general confirms, saying that the vampires responsible for collecting blood disappeared to join the pure blood vampire. So the protagonist asks if it wouldn't be easier if they directly eliminate that vampire, to which the general responds that in theory, yes, but Arian tells him that Julius, the last pure blood vampire, has not been seen at all, except for the day he killed the king, and the protagonist asks why, if he is supposed to be very strong. But she tells him they don't know because Julius doesn't participate in battles at all. This makes the protagonist suspicious, and he says that vampires are supposed to feed on human blood. But if they are going to kill all humans, they would run out of food, so their goal is contradictory. And even though they think the same, the general tells him that they can only fight and survive for the moment. So they go to the headquarters to get more details, the last human city that hasn't fallen, where the research on the protagonist and the design of his body were conducted. At that moment, the caravan arrives, and the general tells him to see the last place of hope for humanity, called Bahal, when suddenly they see that it is on fire, and the protagonist mocks it. We see a vampire sleeping when suddenly he wakes up screaming that Benzel is dead, and if the enemy is finally there to kill him, and he tells his mom that he doesn't want to die. While she calms him down and tells him that there is no enemy, she says it's sad news because Benzel was a fragile but beautiful vampire, but it's hard to believe that a human being killed him. So Julius asks a vampire named Yen to find out who killed him. Then we are given information about the city of Bahal, which is called the Holy Land for several reasons. And one of them is that it seems like God made it perfect, since it's on the edge of the continent. And although it didn't grow much, it's a land that can produce its own food. And it is protected by mountains and the sea, making the only entrance through a bridge, which facilitates defense even when the enemy outnumbers the defenders tenfold. The protagonist's group arrives, and he says that the place is already destroyed. Then the general finds a soldier named Leonard, who is glad that everyone is okay. But when he introduces himself to the protagonist, he seems to despise him, so the protagonist angrily asks who he is. And the general introduces him as the leader of the wall guard, who asks them to come in. The group enters the city, and the protagonist asks why everything looks so bad. So Leonard explains that they had to give up the defense of the outer bridge. The general asks what the problem is, as they believe that defeating Benzel would give the city some relief. And this surprises Leonard, who disdains the protagonist again and explains that a vampire invasion began when they left. It was a force they had never seen before, with strange and twisted appearances, and shows they put on to massacre the soldiers, which the protagonist finds amusing. He also tells them that they broke through the main gate, which they managed to block, but the next invasion caused too much damage. So he asks the protagonist to stay there to protect the bridge until the city is repaired. However, the protagonist refuses because he says they can serve as flesh shields for him to live longer. This infuriates Leonard, who tells him that he's alive because 136 of his comrades died in experiments to become motorized humans, just like the researchers who built his limbs, and all the soldiers who protected the city while they did it. But the protagonist is a gladiator who knows nothing about sacrifice, and he tells him that the dead knight should have been him and not the protagonist. Then he approaches him and whispers in his ear that he's a piece of shit, which angers Leonard. The soldier tries to attack the protagonist, but he sends him flying out of the building, and Aryan reminds him not to act aggressively while they are connected, to which the protagonist agrees and says it was in self-defense. Later, we see Leonard returning but injured, and Aryan tells the protagonist that no matter how strong he is, he can't do it alone, because it takes a lot of manpower and supplies to make his limbs, so they must save as many people as possible and defend the Holy Land to ensure the supply doesn't get cut off. The protagonist then agrees to fight and asks to be shown his weapons, but the general says there are only two, which surprises both Aryan and the protagonist. And Leonard apologizes, as almost all the personnel were dedicated to defense, so they didn't have time to build weapons. And the protagonist says they should at least give him a properly functioning arm. Then he tries another one, which turns out to be a shield that changes size and is fire resistant, so the protagonist says it's not bad. There he asks when he can have another bone launcher, but Aryan tells him it will take more than half a year due to the materials. Later, the protagonist finishes choosing a sword and says he is ready to fight. Aryan tells him that they went through a whole selection process, and he was the most suitable, so he shouldn't worry because she believes in him and that he will save the world, although that didn't matter to him in the first place. Then the protagonist asks if there were 136 humans who tried to become motorized humans, to which she says yes, and the protagonist asks her why she did it after seeing 136 die, to which she replies that it was what needed to be done, and he says he doesn't understand. Both of them wait in the building when Leonard appears and warns them that the vampires are already there. Gunter goes out to the entrance and disconnects, so Aryan asks him to survive. And after putting on his helmet, the protagonist says he will, and that no matter who comes, he will tear them apart. Then a silhouette appears on the horizon, who says that today's audience is only one person. The protagonist thinks that Evelyn's stance is strange and doesn't seem to move quickly, so he plans to use a jumping attack. And when he gets close, he will kill her with a single strike. Then the vampire welcomes the audience and introduces herself as Evelyn, who has prepared to give a perfect performance. And the first act is the king of the pigs and her. Suddenly, the protagonist jumps and declares it's his victory, But when he strikes, he doesn't feel any contact and wonders how she avoided it. Evelyn tells him that he's a rude audience and must follow the order of the performances to maintain the rhythm. And we see that her body is contorted as she says that the first part of the show is the king of the pigs and the choir of dwarves. Then she uses her blood power, and a huge tent appears in front of the protagonist. Suddenly, a vampire dwarf emerges from it and attacks him. The protagonist repels the attack, and he sees an army of them surrounding him and attacking him together. But he effortlessly defeats them with a single blow and continues killing them mercilessly. More of them come out of the tent, and the protagonist tells them to stop wasting his time because they are weak. He makes his way to the tent to cut the leader's throat. But suddenly he sees something else inside, and a blast of flame comes out of the tent to attack the protagonist, who blocks it with his shield. Then a massive pig appears, and the protagonist understands the title of the act. The pig breathes fire again, and the dwarf says that its fire burns everything, telling the protagonist to turn into ashes. But he sees that the protagonist is still alive, so he tells the king to unleash more power. The protagonist prepares his sword and throws it towards the pig, asking them if they think they can kill him with just that. And then he jumps forward to kill both of them. The protagonist says that what they prepared is much less than he expected and asks them where the second part of the performance is before entering the tent. The protagonist enters and tells Evelyn that she decorated everything with great taste. She thanks him and tells him that he is the first to reach that point for the second part, so she prepared it with all her heart. But the protagonist doesn't let her finish and launches another attack. She manages to dodge it again, and the protagonist can't believe that she's avoiding it. Then she uses her powers again, and blood covers her completely, while saying that the second act is the confession of the suffering clown Evelyn, and she hopes he enjoys it. The battle begins, and the protagonist launches fast attacks around her, but none of them manage to hit her. So the protagonist throws a barrage of debris at her, but she dodges them all. And from her mouth, she pulls out two swords with which she attacks the protagonist, who also manages to block her for a moment. He wonders how he can land an effective blow when she catches him off guard and throws him out of the tent. On the walls, the group watches the confrontation, and the general asks Leonard how the protagonist is doing, to which he says they are losing ground, as the protagonist's attacks don't seem to work, although he took care of the dwarves. The fight reaches the bridge, and the protagonist propels himself forward to attack, but still fails to land a hit, so he tells Evelyn that she's as stupid as a cockroach. The general asks if there is any way they can help him, but Leonard says that all the siege weapons were destroyed in the previous battle, so they can only use bows. But Arian says they should avoid fighting on the bridge since the protagonist's muscles are too dense. And as we see him falling from the bridge, she says that if he falls into the water, he will sink without being able to return to the surface. Something heavy falls into the water, but then we see that the protagonist managed to cling to the bridge with his sword, since Arian warned him that if he fell into the water, he would sink, and with such a strong current, even a normal person would be swept away. The protagonist checks his remaining time and sees that he has little left, so he thinks it will be a difficult fight. There, Evelyn launches herself at him again, and the fight continues. The protagonist says that she is definitely strong, much stronger than Benzel, but that the general and Arian will soon make a big move, when suddenly they call him and tell him to retreat. The protagonist quickly enters the castle, and the soldiers indicate the direction he should go, so he wonders what the plan is. The protagonist reunites with the group, who tell him that the strategy is to hold out until dawn while they initiate the charge, since he is the only one who can fight a higher-ranking vampire on equal terms. There are 5 hours left until dawn, so Arian tells him that he needs to recharge every 2 hours. The staff starts to change his arm and perform maintenance when the girl tells him that the operation has a major weakness, and that is that recharging his energy takes more time than he thinks. The protagonist asks how long, and she tells him that it takes about 20 minutes to refill the 2 hours of charge. Plus, he needs to be in a stable state to receive the energy properly, so he can't recharge during combat or while fleeing from vampires, so they need a way to protect him and Arian, and the protagonist asks if it's possible. There, Leonard opens the door slightly, then closes it, and we see that the city soldiers are preparing to fight. While Leonard tells him that they need to hold on for 20 minutes, the protagonist says that ordinary people are never a match for high-ranking vampires, so if they wait 20 minutes, everyone will die. And the general tells him that he knows, as do all the soldiers, but they still went out to fight. Outside, the soldiers form a formation, and Leonard says that if they don't burn there and now, who will light up that darkness? When suddenly the gate is broken, and inside the building, the group hears the agonizing screams of the soldiers. Outside, we see that Evelyn killed them all and is about to finish off Leonard when the protagonist manages to trap her, and he asks her if she didn't expect a man to come out of the wall. Leonard asks him what he's doing since he still has time to recharge, and the general is surprised that the attack worked with just one arm, as they remember the protagonist's words, who told them that now that he's used to it, fighting with just one arm won't harm him, and since only 5 minutes have passed since he started recharging, the energy could last him until morning, and he takes Evelyn to fight elsewhere, saying that it's the location of the third act, at the bottom of the ocean where no one can escape. Both fall into the water, and the protagonist manages to hit Evelyn, so he tells her in his mind that it is difficult to fight in that environment. As he begins to pierce through her body, he tells her that he will break her heart that way. Evelyn screams in pain, so she wraps around the protagonist like a snake and impales him with a sword in the arm. She then tears it off, but when they reach the bottom, the protagonist also tears off one of the vampire's arms. So they continue to mortally wound each other until the bottom explodes in blood, and we see Evelyn trying to escape. But the protagonist appears and manages to bite her, thinking that it's all over. He tears off her flesh and exposes her heart, while asking her in his mind if she believes she can kill him. He is about to bite her heart when she is about to pierce him with her sword. Suddenly, we see the protagonist's memories, in which a woman reminds him that no one goes to the dump where she found him, and he himself said so. He was dying and he spat out a small scream with all his might. So curiosity got the better of him, as nobody wanted him to be born. For him, who was dying with the garbage, screaming for help had meant a lot. We see the protagonist after having defeated dozens of opponents, and she says that now she knows what it means, and it's revenge, since nobody wanted him to be born or alive. Just like he cried for help as a baby, he must fight until the end and survive like a demon. Because he deserves power, he will receive it, and with it, he will avenge the world that abandoned him. And the protagonist understands it, so she tells him to prepare for the next act, as it is time to show their will. And then we return to the present, where the soldiers find the protagonist's head among the rocks, saying that he was very lucky. Arian holds him in her arms, saying that it is a relief that he has survived once again. And Leonard says to take him inside quickly because the fight is not over yet. After receiving the charge, the protagonist tries to vocalize something, but since he doesn't have a body, he is unable to speak. So Arian tells him to wait a bit until the body and legs are finished. This frustrates the protagonist a lot. Some time later, he regains his body and says he was so frustrated that he thought he was going to die. He asks them if they took care of Evelyn, but Leonard tells him that they believe she is still alive. The protagonist says it's not possible because he remembers biting her heart. But Leonard tells him that they found the footprints of a woman coming from the sea, so it must have been the high-ranking vampire he fought with. They followed the trail and found a suspicious carriage, which they assumed is the vampire's hideout. But even though the sun came out, they were no match for him, so they didn't confirm it. The protagonist tells them they must have seen it wrong because he bit her heart with his teeth. But Leonard says they need to check the security and asks the protagonist to go before it's too late. Some time later, we see that the protagonist accompanied them to the carriage, which indeed looks suspicious, but he is certain that he bit her heart. Leonard tells him to hurry inside. The protagonist approaches and finds a bunch of fresh footprints, as well as seeing that the windows are blocked, so it seems like a vampire hideout. But he has the advantage that the sun is up, and if something goes wrong, they can bring it down with the carriage. Although everything is quiet, despite the possibility of minor vampires trying to prevent the attack. Then the door opens by itself, and the protagonist enters, thinking it's empty. When it closes again, the protagonist is attacked in the darkness. However, he knocks one of the dwarves away and captures another to tell them to stop. The dwarves cease their attack, and the protagonist tells them they are too weak to be vampires, to which they respond that it's difficult to walk or fight there because their bodies are a failure, and they can't beat him now. So finally, it's time to end the show. The protagonist reprimands them for killing people without hesitation, but the dwarf tells him it's what they promised, and the vampire's promise is absolute, and he will show him around for the final act. The dwarf leads him through the place, where many more dwarves are watching from the darkness, so the protagonist says they are very noisy despite not being pigs. There, the dwarf explains that they were not raised as humans, as their owners wanted them to be obedient pigs and make them a good product. Then they reach the end of the place, and Evelyn formally presents herself as the last and most beautiful product. The protagonist realizes that she doesn't seem willing to fight, and she welcomes him in a friendly manner. The protagonist asks her how she's alive despite him biting her heart, and Evelyn explains that she only bit a part, enough not to die, but since it's the source of her power, if it's not intact, she can't control the blood. And the protagonist says that if that's the case, she's just a piece of firewood in the sun and prepares to attack her, while saying that this time, he will be the one to survive. Outside, Leonard and the soldiers are still waiting, and the leader asks them how much time they have left. The soldier says 50 minutes, which is a lot of time, and says they will only enter if they haven't heard anything from the protagonist when there are 10 minutes left. Then another soldier asks if those vampires used to be human, because he heard that orphaned children and city vagrants kept disappearing, and he found a very strange facility while searching for their whereabouts, where there were tools for breaking bones, and a lot of steel frames, in addition to small crushed and broken skeletons piled up like mountains. It was a place for manufacturing merchandise, where they prepared and sold them. And the smaller the size, the more twisted the selling price. The other soldier asks who would buy something like that, and the narrator says they are just rumors. But the buyers were traders and aristocrats who bought them as symbols of wealth or power, and some of the survivors were sold to circuses. He thought it was a ghost story, but if it's true, the vampires are the victims, and the leader they are trying to capture is human, so he asks if it's really worth it. Inside the hideout, we see that Evelyn evaded the protagonist's attack. She asks him to hold her tight because she is going to scrape and break his bones, since even when she screamed for them to kill her, they ignored her. And she tells him that one day they suddenly let her go, so she asked them why they bothered her so much and then easily gave her freedom. To which they only responded that the pandemic was over. Then she tells the protagonist that, finally, she has a question, and it is what is trendy now. To which the protagonist replies that fun is trendy, but no matter what happens, he will survive until the end because that is the story of a man. And Evelyn says that is also a tough and lonely performance, and the protagonist delivers the final blow, killing them all. Back in the city, a villager tells another that 2 high-ranking vampires have already been killed in Bahal, and it must be because they made some kind of weapon, and a large number of survivors are arriving in the city. They say there were 8 high vampires, so there are only 6 left, and now they are heading to the city, so they should help. But they say their side of the sea is the most likely to survive since vampires hate water. When the sound of something enormous catches their attention. The next day, Arian dresses up the protagonist, as the girl says that the queen will visit the outskirts of the city to commemorate the death of the 2 high-ranking vampires. So, the protagonist and the general say that she is an incredible person, to which the old man adds that she is now the ruler of the city. And he asks the protagonist not to say anything strange to her, as it will be a headache and he must endure it. Some time later, a carriage arrives in the city, and the queen's butler orders everyone to bow before her, the sole heir of the royal family, and everyone does except the protagonist. She complains about the bad smell and dirt, and the protagonist says it's normal because they are on a battlefield. So, the general hits him to make him quiet. She confuses his name and then approaches to tell him that he is ugly, but due to his body being remodeled. The queen says she ventured into such a dangerous area to praise the achievement of defeating 2 high-ranking vampires, and her butler praises her for it but says that the exterior is very dirty, so they should continue the conversation inside. There she lets it slip that she is also dirty and asks the protagonist what he wants as a reward for his actions. However, Arian is the one who responds, telling her that they need labor and supplies to improve the protagonist. However, the queen tells her that she didn't ask her, and although she acknowledges her contribution, as the last of the royal family, she is obligated to invest in various possibilities to secure the future. So, the support she already provides is all they will have. The protagonist doesn't understand this, so the general explains to him that it's because she didn't believe in the Dead Knight's plan at first. Then Arian requests that at least those who sacrifice themselves for the plan be officially recognized as heroes. But the queen says that the Dead Knight's project is a secret, so everything related to it must remain that way. And she says that the protagonist's reward will be a title and land, and he must kiss her hand to accept them. But the protagonist says that despite the situation in which he fought alone, they bring a crazy woman who claims to be the queen, so humanity must be doomed. This enraged the queen, when Leonard suddenly enters, saying that a huge guy is approaching the city. Later, the general scolds the protagonist for his attitude towards the queen, but he says he doesn't care because he doesn't want to earn her favor. There, the survivor tells them that his city was destroyed in one day, with a single blow. Then the general sees something, and they realize that it is a colossal vampire heading towards them. Upon seeing its size, the protagonist asks how that can be a vampire, and Arian explains to him that, for a vampire, as long as they have a strong will, they can do anything using blood. So, the name of that vampire must be Miranda, the Steel Giant. She brought down the walls of the capital and has steel skin that is unaffected by any attack. A vampire with a reputation that overwhelms the girl. But because of being so famous, a lot of information leaked and its weaknesses were studied. So, the protagonist asks what those weaknesses are, but that's when the girl reveals the harsh truth. That the vampire has no weaknesses. The group sets out to confront it, and the girl tells them that they cannot attack it at that moment because they don't know where its heart is. And if it reaches Bahal, the city will be destroyed. However, the girl researched as much as she could about him, and she says that he hides when the sun comes out, changing his form to do so. So, that's the moment when the protagonist must kill him. The general says that despite its speed, the vampire shouldn't reach the city yet. So, it is expected to be hiding near a village with many buildings that is on the way to the city. But if they don't find Miranda there, he will enter the city the next day. The group reaches the village and finds that the trail ends with a giant footprint, so it's certain that he is hiding in the houses. Therefore, Leonard says that the soldiers will start investigating from the south, while the protagonist does it from the north. However, he realizes that they have very few troops, as the queen had most of them constructing weapons. So, they begin the search with what they have, entering and destroying the houses to search every corner. The protagonist says that even with his changed form, the vampire must be enormous, so they should focus on large places. Time passes, and it approaches dusk, but the group hasn't been successful. Arian says that it must be because he is hiding in a way they find hard to imagine. The protagonist gets frustrated because he hasn't managed to find the vampire either when suddenly a loud noise and a shadow catch his attention. So, the protagonist runs after it, and when he corners it, he sees that it is something enormous with fangs like a vampire's. In a scene change, one of the high-ranking vampires informs Julius that the protagonist is a dead knight located in Bahal. So, he asks if he left that city for last, and Julius tells him that's where it all began. Therefore, he tried to organize it one last time. But he believes the time has come. He orders them to destroy the city and bring the protagonist to him. Suddenly, in the village, the group hears a loud explosion, so the general rushes to see if it's the protagonist. And he finds him carrying the corpse of a bear on his back. The protagonist asks if they are sure he is hiding there because he doesn't even know what he's looking for. Then Arian responds that they didn't have time to prepare properly. Leonard wants to burn down all the houses to speed up the search, but the girl warns him that it could cause a fire that spreads to the forest. They continue arguing until the general shouts that he cannot give up because the next battlefield will surely be Bahal, and he will make sure to stop its destruction, so he returns to a place he couldn't check properly before and runs off. This surprises the protagonist, and Leonard tells him it's because the general's family is in the city. He has a daughter he cares a lot about, so he's also going back to search because they have no time left. Night falls in the village, and we see the general checking one of the houses where he says he hasn't found anyone. Suddenly, he hears a sound behind him coming from a small red chest, and when he stares at it, he sees it move slightly. We see the house from the outside when suddenly the roof explodes into pieces as a mass of flesh sends the general flying. Arian and the protagonist witness this, so they rush to help the old man, and the protagonist says he knew that would happen. The general says he found the vampire and that he could have killed him. The protagonist asks him what he's talking about, and the general reveals that when he had the knife in his hand and saw him, he discovered it was a small child. At that moment, the protagonist looks up and sees the vampire grow furious to its maximum size. Then it launches a direct blow towards them. The vampire strikes his fist against the ground, but the protagonist manages to dodge it and protect Arian and the general. The knight asks them if they have any other way to fight, but the general tells him there isn't, and he apologizes for being hesitant when it came to killing Miranda, so the protagonist throws him aside. Then he looks up and sees that the vampire ignores them and continues on his path, so he asks if they are not going to fight. Arian supposes that it's because his top priority is Bahal, and she says that everything will be over if the city falls, so they must prevent him from reaching it no matter what happens. As Miranda crosses the village, he crushes all the soldiers he encounters with his feet. When the protagonist appears on a rooftop carrying a stone pillar, he spins it around and throws it at the giant. However, it does nothing and splits in half, so the protagonist leaps and strikes his skin with all his might. But it doesn't cause any damage, so he wonders if his fist truly cannot penetrate his skin. And he delivers an even stronger blow than before, generating an expanding shockwave that shines as if it were sparking. But it only ends up shattering his hand without even scratching the vampire. who becomes aware of his presence and attempts to crush the protagonist. He dodges it and runs up his leg while saying that there is no one without weaknesses, no matter how big they are, so he is certain that there is a weak point. Then the giant uses his other hand and almost crushes the protagonist, who keeps running until Miranda grabs him by one leg and lifts him in front of his eyes. That's where the knight realizes that his eyes are exposed. But before he can do anything, the vampire uses his fingers to tear him apart. Back in the city, the queen watches as Miranda approaches from the distance, while the guards alert everyone that he is crossing the ocean. The queen says that no vampire is indestructible, and there have been several cases where low-ranking vampires were defeated by ordinary people, so they don't need to rely on the protagonist, whom she calls a repulsive corpse. She asks her butler how the preparations are going, and he responds that all adjustments are complete and ready for launch. She turns around and sees behind her a massive network of giant ballistae. She says that its appearance seems to symbolize the power of a noble royal family, a weapon so powerful and beautiful that it surpasses anything ever made by humanity, with hundreds of giant arrows ready to fly with the tension of 1,000 horses. Surely, they will pierce the steel skin of the vampire, and the moment he falls, everyone will realize that she is the true empress and hero who will rule humanity. So she will show them the power of her great royal family and prove that she is not mistaken. She raises her hand and then forcefully brings it down, giving the order for the ballistae to fire. The protagonist's group follows Miranda's tracks near his footprints, until they find a pile of remains, and the general asks if this is really the last trace, to which a soldier responds affirmatively. The old man approaches, concerned, and asks if these few pieces of flesh are all that remains of their efforts to save humanity. He takes one of them and squeezes it tightly while saying that if he hadn't hesitated at that moment, none of this would have happened. So he apologizes to the protagonist. But then something falls behind them, and they see that it's him, who tells them that he is still alive. Arian and the general are surprised, and the girl runs towards him, telling him that she's glad he's still alive. As they travel back to the city, the protagonist tells them with difficulty what he discovered about Miranda, that his eyes are not covered by skin, so if they can't open his mouth, they should attack his eyes. However, Arian says that it won't be of any use if they don't destroy his heart, so the protagonist says that his plan is not that, but rather to enter the body through the eyes, and the girl says that it could work, but the problem is reaching his head. At that moment, a loud sound catches their attention, and they see that it's the queen's weapon firing at the vampire. It hits him forcefully with overwhelming numbers. The group peers out of the carriage, curious to see if the projectiles manage to do something to their enemy, but they see that he emerged unharmed and only covered his face with a hand to protect it. One of the soldiers informs the queen that the giant did not fall and is still approaching, so she asks her butler about the progress of the next plan, but he doesn't respond. This infuriates her. Meanwhile, Miranda reaches the fortress, and the protagonist's group manages to enter the castle, where the general continues to blame himself for not killing the child. Suddenly, his daughter, named Audrey, appears and embraces him, happy that he is safe. The general asks her why she hasn't evacuated, as he told her to flee when the giant crossed the sea. But she tells him that if she had done that, there would be no one who could rebuild the protagonist. Besides, he no longer needs to worry about her because she is already bigger than him. Then Audrey sees the protagonist and introduces herself to him as the general's daughter, extending her hand. But she apologizes because she forgot that he doesn't have an arm. So Arian asks her to connect all the body parts and provide a 350 type climbing weapon to ascend the Titan. Audrey prepares to do so when suddenly the Titan's leg pierces through the castle, taking the girl and her helpers right in front of the astonished general. The castle stone crumbles, and Audrey falls into the void, but the general manages to grab her hand at the last second. He tells his daughter to hold on and that he will lift her up in a moment, but she says he won't be able to do it because he is old and weak, so at least he should take the torso for the protagonist. But he tells her that she is more important when suddenly the debris he was holding onto breaks, and they both start to fall. So the protagonist jumps, and with only his head and one arm, he manages to cling on and bite the general's arm to prevent their fall. And although the general says nonsensical things, he thanks the protagonist for saving them. Miranda continues to advance, so Leonard and the soldiers tell the people to drop their luggage and evacuate everyone to the outskirts of the island. Then the queen appears and asks the soldier how long he thinks they can hold on. Leonard tells her that at the current rate, he doesn't think they can hold on through the night. So she asks where the protagonist is, and he tells her that his group is preparing to fight the giant in a different way. She says that's it, and everyone is going to die on an island with only one entrance and one exit. and if that happens, then there will be no one left to judge her. So she says it's not a bad thing, turns around, and leaves. The scientists hurry to connect the protagonist, and Arian tells him that he must leave as soon as they finish. The protagonist agrees, and while looking at his new arm, he says it's an incredible weapon and sticks it to the general's head to test how sticky it is. Arian explains that it's based on a lizard's hand, designed to facilitate climbing in slippery places. The general thanks him again for saving them, but the protagonist tells him that it wasn't for them, but to save his body. So the general accuses him of always thinking of himself and says he should have happy moments with someone else. But the protagonist tells him that there is no one else because his parents threw him into the garbage dump. Gladiators tried to kill him, just like the audience who bet money, and there was always someone who wanted to kill him or bring him down, and he only survived by fighting to the end. And he will do the same on this occasion because he will be the one to do it. This leaves the general thoughtful, and then he tells him that's the life of a man with nothing. At that moment, the scientists finish the connection, and the protagonist stands up to go out and fight. When Arian stops him, and before he leaves, she tells him that she hopes to see him again tomorrow. To which the protagonist only responds by saying that he finds it funny and leaves the castle ready to face the giant. Terrified, the citizens watch as the imposing vampire approaches, when suddenly it notices the protagonist, who starts climbing rapidly up its knee. Once again, it tries to crush him with its hand, but he dodges it and gains momentum to shoot forward, circling around its body to reach the lower back. The protagonist thinks he is safe and just needs a bit more when he sees Miranda's hand manages to grab him, and he is forcefully ejected from its body. The protagonist emerges from the rubble and sees that he has lost a hand, but immediately prepares to try again. With a leap, he returns to the battle in front of the astonished citizens, who wonder what he is. The protagonist runs through the hallway of a building when Miranda's fist appears to strike him, but he evades it and uses the debris to propel himself back into the vampire's body. There, with his new arms, he climbs and dodges his enemy's limbs. However, the vampire manages to hit him again, and before he can recover, it seizes the opportunity to strike him down on the ground and finish him off. The protagonist survives by clinging to Miranda's knuckles, from where he looks at the rubble, and he discovers that beneath the city there is another underground space that seems deep, making him wonder why such a place exists on the island. At that moment, Miranda notices his presence and swings its arm forcefully to send the protagonist flying again, and while trapped in the debris, it strikes him. The protagonist loses a foot but remains focused on the fight, dodging the vampire's attacks, even losing one of his improved arms, until with a furious shout, he manages to reach the area under the nape of its neck, where he says he's almost there and just needs a chance to reach the other side of its eyes. Miranda is about to remove the protagonist from its body when suddenly it notices a silhouette that freezes it for a moment. The protagonist takes advantage of this, and with a powerful leap, he manages to rise a few meters above the vampire's head. This causes it to turn its head upwards, and the protagonist lets himself fall at that moment, shouting for it to die, with the hands of his enemy about to trap him. Some time ago, we see a small cloth doll on the floor, which is lifted by equally small hands. We then see that they belong to a child who recounts that he couldn't do anything while a monster knocked down his brother, because it was too big for him, as well as being very tough. Then we see Julius telling him not to worry because in the world he will create with him, there will be no more monsters. So, the child turns to look at him hopefully and smiles. There, we see Miranda's eyes, and the silhouettes he saw belonged to a girl who protected her younger brother, both observing him with fear. This reminded him of his past, which made him hesitate for a moment, and it is then that the protagonist appears to pierce him through his eye before he can stop him with his arms, causing him to disintegrate before the astonished gazes of all the citizens. Amid the fragments of the vampire flying through the air like ashes, the dismembered protagonist appears, walking among the people with the help of a stick serving as a crutch. The villagers wonder what it is, observing his body and considering him a monster, which the protagonist doesn't care about until someone asks him if he is an old man. We see that it is the girl Miranda saw, who asks the protagonist if he is the person who brought down the giant. He only asks her in return what she wants him to do and turns around to continue his path, when the little girl thanks him because he saved her and her brother's lives, and they both express their gratitude. This makes the protagonist pause for a moment and only let out a small laugh before continuing on his way. Back at the castle, Audrey exclaims to the protagonist that he is amazing for being able to fly around without an arm and a leg, so she is sure he was born to be a warrior. She tells him that if he were handsome, she would have built him a statue and maybe planted some hair to celebrate his victory. But her father, embarrassed, tells her to stop making such a fuss. Then Arian appears, putting her hand on the protagonist's shoulder and says she's glad to see him again. The protagonist asks if that's so because her expression didn't change at all, and she makes a terrifying attempt to smile that only makes him uncomfortable. At that moment, the queen arrives, saying that she feels like everyone is in a good mood, because the protagonist finally brought down the giant, but the damage he caused was severe, although not as severe as it would have been without her quick evacuation order, but still, all the weapons and the facilities to build them were destroyed. So, it's time to decide who is responsible. And she tells the general that she knows what she's talking about, because she heard that he hesitated at the decisive moment to kill the vampire. He will pay for his mistake with a public execution. Audrey tries to intercede for her father, but the queen refuses. So, the protagonist says that she is responsible for wasting her troops, but still, in public, she is unable to admit that it is her fault, which annoys her when suddenly another vampire appears, who tells her to keep playing queen. This surprises them both when suddenly the vampire decapitates the protagonist before he can do anything, and he says that he is the younger brother of the king, known as the Hound of Belbrick, who, by his promise to Julius, is there to take the protagonist and bring him with him. The queen's knights try to confront the vampire, but like the protagonist, he cuts them in half so quickly that they can't even get close to him. So, he asks them not to waste their lives because he is a true member of the royalty, and he is only there to take the protagonist to Julius as promised, so he won't kill them if they don't get in his way. And he asks them if their lives are worth it just for that head. This convinces the knights, who allow the vampire to pass when he approaches them. Then the queen tells him that she had heard rumors, but now she sees that he truly became a real monster while calling the vampire uncle. He asks her if she will stand in his way for the protagonist's head, and the queen simply closes her eyes and steps aside, letting him pass. After that, the vampire tells her that she makes a lot of noise with her steps and that a true member of the royalty never makes noise when walking. This angers the girl. The vampire leaves the castle and walks among the people with the protagonist's head held high without anyone getting in his way. The general shouts that they must stop him because if he reaches the forest, it will be difficult to track him and fight. The sun is about to rise, so he says they must stop him long enough for him not to enter the forest until then, but they don't have weapons to do it. Then Audrey wonders why the vampire isn't running, and he says it's because the royalty does not run in the eyes of others, which annoys the protagonist. The vampire is about to cross the bridge when someone shouts at him to stop. The protagonist looks up and sees that it is Leonard, who says he will stand in his way for the protagonist's head, because he believes that head is the hope to save humanity. The vampire tells him that all the humans he has known have trampled on and despised other humans, so humanity only harms itself, and he asks Leonard if it is worth giving his life for someone like that. Leonard thinks for a moment, but in the end, he says he believes so because he believes in the goodness of humanity, and that it will not lose its light. Because even though humans harm each other, the important thing is to heal those wounds instead of seeing humans become monsters by their own fault. The vampire says his speech is touching, but in the end, only 5 people believe in that. Leonard tells him that he wouldn't understand and tells the protagonist that just as he saved them before, now they will save him. And they launch an attack against the vampire. Moments earlier, Leonard thanks the soldiers who accompanied him for fighting by his side. They tell him that, although they would follow him to the end, it is a meaningless death, and they are afraid of it. However, Leonard tells them that he is not afraid of dying. He explains to them that their sacrifice will not be recorded like that of great heroes in a story, because they are not generals or kings, but despite how humble they may be, if they have the strength to change something, then it is not a meaningless sacrifice at all. This motivates his men, whom we immediately see severely injured on the bridge floor, and Leonard, who has lost his right arm. The vampire tells him that his actions were arrogant, but he is proud of his courage, and for that reason, he will spare their lives because showing mercy is also a royal duty. The vampire and the protagonist are about to reach the forest, where he says he will finally be able to run, when a last voice behind him tells him to wait, and we see that it is Arian, who says she is willing to fight him. The vampire warns her that he will show no mercy towards her, while the protagonist shakes his head desperately to prevent her from doing so. But she says that without that head, they probably won't have a future, so she will fight to save a man who has fought alone his whole life. The vampire says it's a somewhat romantic phrase, which blushes the girl, but he says he appreciates her will, so he will cut her without hesitation. But before he can strike, the sun's rays dissolve the vampire's arms, and he realizes that dawn has arrived. And we see that the light already illuminates the entire ground except for the shadow of the tree where the vampire is standing. He says that the forest is just 50 steps away, a small step but quite significant. Some time later, the queen arrives at the scene and mocks her uncle, asking him if he's not in a good mood. And she tells him that it's a true royal disgrace that he hides in the shadow of a small tree to survive, when he could have used some low-ranking vampire to cover him. But no one would have followed him, and he wouldn't have let a subordinate do it for him. So the vampire asks her what she will do now. The queen says she is undecided between cutting down the tree or setting it on fire. So the vampire says that's not how the honorable royal family would do it, because he did not kill unnecessarily, and although he could have run, he didn't, thus protecting the honor of the royalty, while she wants to use his weakness to cowardly kill him. Arion tells the queen that she is being deceived because he was trapped in the shadows thanks to the knights who sacrificed themselves, so they must finish him off at that moment. But the vampire offers her an honorable offer as a member of the royalty. We see a flashback of the queen when she was younger, where her uncle calls her pathetic for not living up to royal etiquette, and he says that she is not a true member of the royalty. So we return to the present, where her butler is surprised that she accepted her uncle's offer, and she says that it is to preserve her honor and prove that she is a true woman of the royalty. However, she asks him where he has been all this time, as he disappeared suddenly. He says that he was looking for an escape route for her, but she knows that he was probably hiding. So she warns him that if he does it again, she will rip his arms and legs off. And he says he will keep that in mind with an evil smile. Back with the protagonist's group, Arion informs them that the queen agreed to a duel against the vampire. So Audrey questions how she could do that when they had the chance to kill him thanks to Leonard's sacrifice. Arion says they have no choice, so the general asks what kind of duel will take place. Then we return to the outside where the vampire is, where a warrior named John Byron says he will defeat the monster with that fist as the queen's spokesperson. There, Arion tells them that it is an honorary fistfight duel, where one at a time the contenders punch each other in the face, and the punch can be dodged at the cost of honor, as the one who takes even a single step after being hit loses. Audrey wonders if they are going to make such a significant decision about the fate of humanity with that kind of joke, and the general says that the protagonist's head is at stake, so he still hopes they will win. Arion explains that in a family duel, each side has 4 spokespeople who come out to fight, but since the vampire is alone, they must win just once. Byron thinks he can win because he attacks first. He just needs to knock him down in the first attack. And if he wins the duel, he will achieve a higher rank, even with the possibility of aspiring to the throne. The duel referee reminds the 2 participants of the rules and starts the match by giving Byron the first hit. He wastes no time and immediately attacks with all his strength. However, although the vampire Belbrick says his punch is fierce, the referee sees that he didn't move a single step. So now it's his turn, and with a single punch, he sends Byron flying, completely twisted and disfigured. The queen expected this, so she brings forward her second spokesperson, named Nicolau Beek, who says that the duel is not only about strength but also about attacking vital points to make the opponent panic. So he unleashes the blow with all his strength, and it seems like he finishes off Belbrick. However, the referee says that he didn't move a single step, and we see that his torso was completely twisted, but his legs didn't move. Nicolau complains about this, but the referee says that the rule is not to take more than 1 step backward. So Belbrick recovers and strikes the big guy, sending him flying far away and disfigured just like Byron. Then the third spokesperson, named Joseph Rambler, steps forward. He says that he analyzed Belbrick and found a fatal weakness in his patterns, but he also ends up defeated by the vampire. Audrey doesn't understand what they're doing, but Arion tells her that they bet everything on the last spokesperson because it's someone they already know, and we see that it's the protagonist. Belbrick says he can't accept it because now his head belongs to him, but the queen says that they have his body, so they possess a greater part of him to participate. And she will give him back his head anyway if she loses, so the vampire accepts. So the group reconnects the protagonist with his body, and he asks what the hell they are doing if they could have killed the vampire earlier. Then the queen tells him it's for honor, something a man like him would never understand, and he says he doesn't even want to do it. The queen tells him that he will still lose his head if he loses the duel, but moreover, if he wins, she will spare the general's life. So they must prepare for the duel at dusk. The moment approaches, and the scientists attach a new arm to the protagonist. Despite its great strength, he must be careful because it is not durable and can break easily. The protagonist says the color is strange, and Arian tells him it's because it's made from the arms of the spokespersons. Then Arian tells him it's incredible because the protagonist said that his life was the most important, but his body is made of death and sacrifices of others. Then the final duel arrives, and Belbrick smiles because he knew what the queen was going to do. That's why he strengthened the joint of his leg so that it wouldn't move, even if the top part flew away, so there's no way they can defeat him. And he doesn't care if it's a cowardly tactic because he just wants to see her humiliated due to what her father did to him. But then the referee starts the duel, and Belbrick is surprised by the speed of the protagonist. The blow is so powerful that the vampire's head goes flying far away, so the protagonist asks if he won. But the referee says no because the body didn't move a single step, so the game continues, and the protagonist says it's his turn to see stars. While his face recovers, Belbrick thinks he scared him. But now that it's his turn, the duel is over, unleashing his strike and telling the queen in his mind that she will never be able to defeat him. Then we see the protagonist before the duel, where Arian and the scientists place reinforcements on him so he could withstand the blows to the head. But they won't last long, so he must finish the game and win before they fail. Then we see the protagonist receiving the vampire's strike, and the vampire is surprised. The referee points out that the protagonist didn't move a step, so he says it's his turn. And with a swift blow, he once again tears off the vampire's head, causing his body to sway slightly. Belbrick regenerates and charges again, asking the protagonist how dare he. But he still can't make him lose his balance. The butler anxiously asks the queen if the protagonist will be able to win, but she doesn't respond. The protagonist tears off Belbrick's head once again, and with each blow, the vampire loses his balance more, and he realizes that the protagonist is stronger than he thought and can't find a good angle to push him. Therefore, at this rate, he is sure that he will lose. This idea infuriates him because he considers it unthinkable for someone of true royalty to lose against a dirty and unqualified individual. So he tells the protagonist that he is the only one with the courage to be king and the only one fit for the position. The protagonist spits out part of the reinforcements and asks the vampire what he wants him to do. That's when the vampire says that it was the queen's father who took away his chance to sit on the throne again. And he opens his blood armor to reveal his mutilated body, saying that it was the king who cut off his arms. So the protagonist says it's a very crazy family, and Belbrick says he will prove how fake they are by never letting him win. But when he throws the strike, the protagonist dodges it and counterattacks, hitting the vampire directly in the chest. This surprises all the spectators. And finally, Belbrick goes flying. The vampire reproaches the protagonist for daring to do something dishonorable like dodging the strike. But the protagonist tells him it's ridiculous, and although he was considering the general to respect the terms, he couldn't bear it anymore. Belbrick tells him not to be arrogant when he realizes he can't control the blood, because the protagonist damaged his heart when he struck him. He lifts him by the neck and says they will now fight for real, so Belbrick tries to make him an offer for the honor of royalty, but the protagonist simply tells him to sleep. The queen panics because she told the protagonist dozens of times not to dodge, and yet he did it anyway. She desperately asks how dare he dishonor the royal family and her. So the butler says that he didn't see that, but he saw how the protagonist endured the strike and then threw a punch that knocked out the vampire. He asks the others if that's what happened, and going along with it, they say it was. Then he asks the scribe how the duel was recorded, so the scribe tears off the page and writes that the protagonist received the strike and then knocked down the vampire with his own. So they say the queen won in an honorable fight, and everyone celebrates her victory. Belbrick regenerates once again and asks the protagonist how long he will keep beating up a defenseless and armless enemy, to which the protagonist responds until sunrise, so the vampire suggests something. And before the protagonist hits him, he mentions the name Julius. Therefore, the night stops, and Belbrick reveals that he knows where Julius is hiding, so if he lets him live, he will lead him to him. And then he won't have to fight the rest of the vampires, only the leader and humanity will win. The protagonist says he doesn't believe him because if Julius dies, Belbrick dies too, so no one in their right mind would do that. But the vampire says he underestimates the promises of vampires. He only promised Julius to bring him the protagonist no matter what, but what happens afterward is not his concern. The protagonist says it's tempting, but he will decide after beating him up a little more and resumes the beating. Some time later, the chained Belbrick tells his suggestion to Arian and the others, saying that he doesn't deserve those restrictions because he is of royalty. So the protagonist threatens to hit him again, and the vampire falls silent. Arian doesn't trust him and asks why he became a vampire if he didn't intend to kill all humans. But Belbrick says he won't reveal it, so the protagonist threatens him again. and the vampire promises that what he will do is lead them to Julius. The group leaves, and Arian says that even though they can't trust him, finding Julius could give them a great advantage. Suddenly, she starts bleeding from her nose. The protagonist says that if they finish Julius, it will all be over, and he's tired of the war. And then the girl faints. The scientists immediately begin treating the girl, who they say has a high temperature and rapid breathing. They remove her clothes so she can breathe better, and the protagonist observes for the first time her superhuman body, which the general says was injected with countless drugs and potions. To detoxify her, they had to add devices that modified her intestines and made her unable to digest food, so she can only eat pre-cooked meals and soups. The protagonist says it's a wonder that she's alive, and the general reminds him that Arian is unique, as it is difficult for a normal human to survive like this. The protagonist asks what caused her to collapse, but the general responds that he doesn't know apart from her temperature, and he asks the protagonist if he was worried about her, to which he replies that he wasn't, but if she dies, he will die too, so he must do whatever it takes to keep her alive. Some time later, the scientists say her breathing has returned to normal, although they haven't found the cause of her fainting, so they can only wait. Then the protagonist realizes that even though they are plugged in, they are not receiving any power. The general scolds him for not plugging her in while she was unconscious, but the protagonist asks if he was supposed to wait for her energy to run out. The general explains that the energy can only flow when she is completely at rest, and it is limited if the person is out of shape or moving vigorously. So Arian is not producing enough energy for the protagonist, and he will have to stay in his current body to avoid losing more. But the general warns him that even that may not work, as if it gets worse, he could lose energy even when connected. And the protagonist says that a slow death like that is even worse than becoming a vampire, since he can't fight or move. The general asks him to take care of the girl while they mobilize their resources to find a solution, and the protagonist reluctantly agrees. Time passes, and the protagonist says there is less than an hour of energy left. Arian complains a little and starts sweating, so the protagonist wipes her with a cloth. There, he realizes how small her face and features are, even her hands. And as he holds one of her hands, he wonders why such a small body can endure so much pain. Just then, Audrey enters with a bucket of water to clean up, and she sees the warrior holding the girl's hand. She apologizes for barging in without warning and then runs out while shouting that the protagonist is holding Arian's hand. Night falls and the fever doesn't decrease, so the protagonist clasps his hands together and begins to pray, saying in his mind the same words she said to him, that he hopes to see her tomorrow. But when morning comes, the protagonist becomes angry that she hasn't woken up despite his pleas, and he sees that the energy is decreasing even though they are connected. So the general says he has no choice but to start developing a new enhanced human. The scientists take Arian and the protagonist down to a basement, where he comes across a plaque filled with names. The general explains that they are all the ones who attempted and failed to become enhanced humans. The protagonist remarks that it's a shame they are in the basement. The scientists say that the materials are ready to create an enhanced human, so the protagonist asks why only one. The general explains that it's because they need many materials, and they only have enough for one person. So the protagonist asks who it will be, and the general says that this time he will do what he has to do and won't escape, revealing that he will be the one to become the enhanced human who saves him. The general says it shouldn't take long, but the protagonist asks what will happen if he fails to become one, to which the old man simply replies that he will make it work. When the scientists arrive and take him away, he asks the protagonist not to tell his daughter. Moments later, the general rides on the stretcher with blue veins, and the scientists explain that the drug injection was successful, and they will soon move on to the second phase. The protagonist asks the old man how it feels to be blue, and he responds that it's neither good nor bad, but they started well. With little energy left, the general gets up and reveals to the protagonist that Audrey is not his biological daughter. This surprises the protagonist. The old man tells him that he lost everything when the mercenaries betrayed him, and he was slowly dying on the street, when a little girl, whose parents had abandoned her, offered him half of her last piece of bread. This act made the general grateful to them as they allowed him to become her father, and it was thanks to her that he could recover from the injury inflicted by another human being. And he tells the protagonist that this is the way to find someone who helps him heal, and he hopes the protagonist can find that. Then the scientists arrive and take the general away to continue with the second phase. As the protagonist runs out of energy, he wonders what is more valuable than surviving. One of the scientists approaches the stone, and we see that in the end, they engrave the name of the general. Then we are told that the general, who became an enhanced human, survived for 12 days. Although it was considered a failure, for 12 days he provided energy to the protagonist, not knowing if it was a miracle or sheer willpower. And on the 11th day, another event occurred, as that night Arian regained consciousness. And although she was very weak, she regained her strength and could produce energy the next day. But after seeing her wake up, the general's health suddenly deteriorated. And in his final moments, he thanked his daughter for giving him hope in that cruel and merciless world. There, we see the memories of the old man, from when he started taking care of Audrey to when they found a house to live in, and the girl had her first partner, saying that it was very beautiful as he fades away and sheds a tear. It is mentioned that Audrey did not cry in front of her father, as she said it was his choice to keep the protagonist alive until Arian woke up, and she would have done the same. But after the old man's death, a silent lament could be heard from his house every night. Some time later, Arian and the protagonist talk about how they must leave to search for Julius the next day, because Belbrick says there are only a few weeks left until everything ends. The protagonist says that everything is calmer than he thought, as the general was alive, dead, and bald. And Arian says that if he hadn't been so determined, they wouldn't even have been able to start the Dead Knight project. And the protagonist says it's nice to see her again and asks her not to faint again, to which the girl smiles at him. At night, the protagonist takes care of Arian when he sees someone approaching the door. And when they enter, he sees that it's the queen's butler, whom he stops with his sword and questions what he's doing there. But he explains that he's not there on the queen's orders. First, he expresses his condolences, as he says he also owed a debt to the general several times. The protagonist admits that he acts differently when he is by the queen's side, and the butler takes it as a compliment, saying that location makes the man. And he says he heard that they are leaving the next day, but there is someone who is eager to see the protagonist. He says that he will then wake up Arian to accompany them, but the butler tells him that only he should go. The protagonist reminds him that if he loses energy, they can only move for 2 hours, even less if they have to fight vampires. And he asks if the person the butler wants to take him to is more important than the destiny of humanity. To which the butler replies yes, as that person is more important than humanity and history itself. A king of kings, an ancestor of humans, and he asks if the protagonist isn't curious to know what is happening between vampires and humans. The pair begins to descend through the catacombs while the protagonist says that he has only seen a fool call himself a king. The butler tells him that this one is different, as he is someone who has guided humanity and embodies the truth itself. The protagonist asks if he isn't talking about the queen, but the butler says he's taking the joke too far. He asks if the queen seems like someone who can lead them. This pleases the protagonist, who tells him it's a funny shit. Then they reach the end of the staircase and find what appears to be a palace. The butler explains that it is an unprecedented underground chamber in history. It was created with countless precious materials and has complete air circulation, as well as drinking water, and rooms for hundreds of servants and caretakers. And the city of Bahal was originally built to sustain the chamber, a place where all the kings of the past descended just before their deaths to live forever, called the Paradise of Kings. Then the butler guides him through the corridors until they reach what appears to be an execution machine. The protagonist asks what that is, and the butler tells him that's where Julius was tied. He explains that normal vampires need human blood to survive, but pure-blooded vampires don't. They didn't need to eat and live forever, so they were magnificent creatures like something out of a myth. And they discovered a surprising fact about them, which is that the blood of a pure-blooded vampire is what powers humans. And we see one of them, an elderly one, drinking the blood and suddenly becoming young. So the butler tells that it was possible to live forever if they kept drinking it. But the blood evaporated as soon as it left the body, so they needed it fast and fresh. That's why Julius was tied to the machine, and the axe would decapitate him constantly to make the blood flow. This gave humans blood for almost 1,000 years and allowed them to enter the greatest era of prosperity in history, unifying all forces, politics, and administration. Earthly kings could only attend at the edge of their death, and depending on how well they had ruled, they were granted the blood. So they had to do everything possible to create a great kingdom. And he says it was all thanks to the country's first king, called Sabuso. However, the protagonist says that something is wrong, and that's why they are at war. Then the butler tells that 41 years ago, a human freed Julius and fled with him. As a result, the underground kingdom began to crumble, and the humans there died in horrible ways, as if their years of life were taken away all at once, dying in the order they drank the vampire's blood. However, King Sabuso survived, and the butler tells the protagonist that it's time to meet him and confront himself. The protagonist enters the room where King Sabuso tells him that he has been observing him for a long time. To the one on the edge of life and death, the dead knight, he welcomes him to his palace. The protagonist tells him that he is very ugly and says he must be very idle to be a great king if he has been observing all the time. The king says that he not only records his life but that of many others, from where they were born, the lives they led, to how they died. That is his power in that kingdom. The protagonist calls him a pervert and asks why he called him if he knows everything. Then the king takes a book and tells him it's Jezebella Hound's life. She could have been a great queen but gave up that destiny after freeing Julius and disappearing together. So the book remains unfinished, and it is his wish to complete it, so he asks the protagonist to ask Julius what he promised Jezebella. The protagonist says that what Julius wants is to kill all humans because he would hate them too if they had chained him for almost 1,000 years. But the king says that hatred is a human emotion that a pure-blooded vampire who has existed for so long does not possess. And he says that Julius wants to kill humans because he made a promise to Jezebella. However, he finds the protagonist's story more interesting, and he tells him that in his final moments, he will make the decision to live or die, to be a human or become a monster, so he is very curious to know how his story will end. The next day, the protagonist puts on his armor and asks Arian if she slept well. She says yes and asks if something happened, but he tells her nothing except that she snored too loudly. Arian says that Julius won't know where they are as long as they have Belbrick, but they must make sure to move quickly and not draw attention. The protagonist considers it a risky bet, but Arian says it's riskier to turn Bahal into a battlefield. Outside, they meet Audrey, who tells them they are ready to leave. The protagonist notices that she cut her hair and asks about the vampire, who is inside the carriage, annoyed that they treat him this way despite being of royalty, but the protagonist threatens to hit him, and he falls silent. And after confirming that they are ready, the group sets off. There, the protagonist remembers the words of King Sabuso, and sighs as he thinks about the choice he will have to make. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you have reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you have been one of the few people to make it here, so comment the word night in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.